Well, excellent. So thank you all for joining again in our social genomics group. We're happy to have Hiram join us from California to present work he's doing on biological aging. He'd invite questions throughout the talk, so you can either raise your hand and I'll interrupt, or you can unmute yourself and ask us to stop. Um, we'll we'll have his presentation for a bit over an hour. So again, interrupt throughout, but also feel free to wait until the end. Hiram has some Madison connections. He was a postdoc here before going to UCLA, and we're very happy to have him back and look forward to having him back in person in the coming year. Hiram, if you want to share your screen and start whenever
Sure.
you're ready.
Perfect. Thank you, Jason, and thank you everyone for coming to today's session. So yeah, as Jason indicated, excuse me, I have some connections and still continue to have connections. As you can see, Alberto Paloni has contributed greatly to this project. This is a project, I just put the authors in alphabetical order, but it should be the other way around. Alberto has contributed greatly to everything that I'll want to show you today. It's a great pleasure again to be here in this seminar. So as Jason indicated, please feel free to interrupt as I go along. I think we'll have enough time to go over the material that I'm going to be presenting. I'm not very good at multitasking, so if you put questions on the chat, I'm not sure I'll be able to see them. But if somebody sees questions there, please let me know and I'll be happy to answer those questions also.
I'll monitor the chat for you, Hiram,
Oh,
so
great.
please feel.
Excellent. Great. So what I'll present today is what we are calling modeling biological age, and it's linked with the aging process. This is something that we call is at the population level. So I'm going to start giving you a brief overview, but we're going to go over towards the middle. I'll show you what we're proposing to do, and then towards the end, a little bit of sort of results that I think would probably spark some interesting questions along the way. So a little bit of background. Some of you perhaps are already familiar with the idea of biological age. I've seen in this seminar some other students and faculty who have presented using some of the indicators from the HRS, the Health and Retirement Study that has some epigenetic clocks. So I'm going to deviate a little bit from that, but I'll get to that in a minute. So there have been several indices that have been proposed, usually to try to get at the underlying physiological deterioration in the human body in particular. And the goal of these indices, and this is going to become quite important for us, the goal of these indices is to try to serve as a better proxy from chronological age. We as demographers tend to use age for mainly all the risks that we study, mortality, fertility, and migration. But we know age is fairly crude approximation for those processes. But what we're trying to do is to assess in a better way, somewhat, the impact of this physiological deterioration. So most of previous indices have been usually proposed more in the clinical setting, like for example, I'm familiar with the Framingham Index or even the metabolic syndrome indicator. More recently, trying to include also the stress mechanisms that some people think operate through the inflammation process, such as the allostatic load. The background is that these type of indicators tend to be computed relatively simple, and I think part of the reason is because they're trying to be used in a clinical setting. So the Framingham score is just depends on a number of indices, indicators that are treated high risk, low risk, and they are just summed up. Or the allostatic load, which is usually kind of binary indicators that are transformed into a Z-score, or even the metabolic syndrome, we usually uses like 5 indicators, again, high risk, no risk, add them up, and having more than 3 is considered to be in metabolic syndrome. Biological age, on the other hand, has been constructed a little bit more elaborate because it has yet been used as a clinical indicator. And what we think of this is a little bit different, and that the aging clock is not going to be necessarily linked to a particular physiological system, although what we are proposing here could very well be targeted to particular physiological systems. So the idea here is that biological age is this underlying biological and physiological deterioration that tends to occur as we age. So ideally, if one would like to capture all this biological and physiological deterioration, we would like to include information from several domains, including biomarkers of some physiological states, perhaps some genetic indicators, or even for older adults, neurodegenerative activity that one might want to capture, and more recently also some epigenetic modifications that one might also want to include as part of the composite of indicators. However, as you're probably familiar, in most large surveys, and I'm thinking in here population level surveys, not the epidemiologic surveys that tend to have a large number of indicators, but most large surveys are based on indicators usually of two kinds, either physiological states or more recently epigenetic indicators. And that is the case, for instance, in the health and retirement study, but not yet the case of the NHANES, although they are moving in the direction of getting epigenetics in NHANES, but NHANES is very rich in terms of physiological states. So just a quick sum up on some of the main indicators that have been used for physiological states. I want to clarify that what I'll be showing you today is a method that we're proposing for biological age that is based on physiological states. We have not yet included epigenetic indicators, although we are sort of going in that direction. That I'll point to possibilities later. So one of the early ways to try to assess the idea of biological age was through regression, as you can imagine. They had a bunch of biomarkers on the right-hand side. They tried to predict chronological age, so they model these biomarkers to predict chronological age, and the predicted value was assumed to represent somewhat the underlying biological age. A second approach was, let's take all those biomarkers and then summarize them into principal components. Let's get the variance of those biomarkers. And to simplify the process, they usually use only the first score, even though one might end up having more than one. But they use only one in order to then go back from the standardization process to then come up with a biological age estimator, in which this is the score that comes from the principal component. A few years ago, there was another method that is actually still widely used, and this is proposed by Clemmer and Duval in 2005-2006. So the way to compute this indicator is a little more elaborate. It involves two general processes. One runs a lot of bivariate regressions, in which on the right-hand side you have chronological age, on the left-hand side you have the biomarker that you're interested in studying. You get a lot of slopes and intercepts, and in the second step, those are combined in here. So the idea is to use bivariate regressions, combine those coefficient estimates from the bivariate regressions to produce an estimator of what they call the biological age. So when one computes all those bivariate regressions and combines those slopes and intercepts, one ends up with something that looks along these lines. It's a little bit more elaborate. And what is interesting is that you're familiar with the aging clocks that HRS has in it. Some of them, like the pheno-age, is based basically on the Clemmer-Duval. So the pheno-age that you see in the health and retirement study is a two-step process. First, they compute biological age using this method, and then they linked that biological age with epigenetic indicators to compute what they call the pheno-age. So as you'll see later, I'm going to be paying quite a lot of attention to this method because, as I said, it's still widely used. So what is it that we are trying to do in our case? Previous methods mostly rely on this strictly linear association between biological age and chronological age. In the case of the Clemmer-Duval, more importantly, the linear method that they propose is a very particular one. It's a constrained regression in which they assume those regressions go through the intercept and there is a one-to-one association between biological age and chronological age. This is by design. This is underlying assumption. So if one looks at the method originally, this is kind of the underlying assumption, how they start modeling the connection between biological age and chronological age, slope of one-to-one association. What we are proposing is a little bit different. What we are saying is, let's try to generalize the approach of considering the link between the biomarkers and chronological age, but rather than doing it directly through a regular regression, we want to generalize it through a structural equation model. The second is that under this approach, this biological age that we're trying to assess is going to be our unobserved latent construct that is going to be linked with biomarkers, and that later could also be linked with chronological age. In addition, by doing this structural equation model, we are now able to relax the linearity assumption between chronological age and biological age, and we might as well assume any other type of model. For instance, right now we're assuming there might in fact be the possibility that chronological age and biological age are exponentially related. They don't have to be linearly related. If this is the case, this translates into a log linear model. So with the SEM, again, we might well model it linearly, as people have done it, or we can model it non-linearly. Perhaps more importantly is that once we do that approach, we are not going to constrain the values of the parameter estimates, as some of the other methods do. And we could actually empirically test whether those parameter estimates do indeed behave in the way that some other models are assuming, or it might well be quite different. For example, in the case of this model in here, if it is a linear model that we have used in the past, then we could actually test whether the intercept is indeed 0 and the slope is indeed 1. Or if it is a nonlinear model, like this is the case, we can actually test whether this is 1 and this is 1. If that is the case, then we go back to kind of the assumption of the Clemeret-Duval. So this is one of the generalizations of the approach in biological age in a slightly different way. So just to give you a sense of what we are having in mind, what we are going to propose is two different variants. In the first, we're going to assume this biological is linearly related to chronological age. This is kind of the traditional approach, if you will. And in the second, we assume there is a nonlinear association between chronological age and biological age. So this is traditionally how the structural equation model is kind of defined in terms of the schematic. So we have a latent construct that is going to be associated with several biomarkers. These are physiological indicators. All these physiological indicators will produce some information about the latent construct that at the second level, kind of structural level, is going to be linked to chronological age. Once we have that structural equation model with two different flavors, linear association between the two or non-linear association between the two, then the question is, how do we transform what comes from that structural equation into something meaningful in terms of biological age? When one constructs these structural equation models, we tend to have what is called the factor scores that come from that structural equation. However, those factor scores are unitless. They are not. They don't have a particular unit associated with them. So we can think of those factor scores as being this conditional mapping of the known biological ages onto vector real values that are going to preserve this ranking on the underlying biological indicator that is implied by the association that we constructed in the structural equation model. So this, because we have individual level data, we could produce this factor score for each individual once we have the survey data. And in order to make sense and to transform or to produce an scale to that factor score, we suggest there are two different possibilities. These are fairly general possibilities. One is what we call the outcome-free estimator. I'm going to show you what that means. And the second is what we call the outcome-dependent. In more further work that we've done with Alberto and colleagues, we've seen that this outcome-dependent, I think, is very promising, and it opens up quite a lot of possibilities, as I'll show you in a minute. So here is the idea that we follow. Let me briefly walk you through this process. So for the outcome-free estimator, so we get the structural equation model, we produce these factor scores. One possibility could be, let's try to anchor these values as a function of chronological age. So in other words, every individual has a factor score from the structural equation model. They just linearly associate them, and then whatever value we predict from here, this is what we are going to assume it is this biological age. Again, these factor scores are already producing their underlying latent physiological deterioration, physiological accumulation from those biomarkers that one uses. This is in the linear case. In the nonlinear case, it's a similar approach. It's just that we use the log linear form to transform these scores. The outcome dependent, on the other hand, is a little more elaborate, and it involves 3 general steps. For our particular case, we're going to use one outcome dependent that is based on mortality. This is the outcome that we are going to use as a way to anchor, as a way to produce a value for biological age using the underlying factor scores. So here are the general steps. We want to estimate this proportional hazard model with a mortality follow-up. I want to estimate two different hazard models. One that only controls for chronological age, and the second one that in addition of controlling for chronological age adds the factor score that comes from the structural equation model. Then we're going to use the estimates from these two equations to predict what biological age might look like. In other words, we use a predicted hazard from this model that becomes the left-hand side. We equate that equation to the first one and solve for age. So that's kind of the general idea. This is what we call outcome dependent, because as part of the process to find it what biological age might be, we're using the mortality as the outcome to allow us to do that. You can imagine many other different outcome dependent estimators. For instance, one might be interested in predicting not necessarily mortality, but perhaps the incidence of a condition, in which case we then would model that condition. And that I think that's what I said is quite interesting to have this outcome dependent estimator, because when one creates this factor scores from the structural equation model, we might be picking up several processes, underlying physiological processes, not all of which would be associated with a higher or lower biological age for the individual, and that depends very much on the outcome that one is interested in studying. So let me, in the past, where I presented this piece, which is not traditionally used to estimate biological age, sounds a little bit confusing. So let me take a couple of minutes, kind of walk you through this process, and then I'll come back to these steps to show you a little bit more how it is computed, because this is not a black box by any means, but let me just walk you through this process. Hopefully it's going to make sense. So here is the idea. We're going to feed these Gompertz models. So I'm going to start with this is what Alberto called it, the non-standard representation, because it is indeed a non-standard representation of the Gompertz that we use. So in the traditional Gompertz model, is just an exponential association between the mortality rate as a function of age, in which we have a beta that is called the slope, but some people call it the Gompertz slope. So this is the traditional Gompertz. All it says is that mortality rates increase exponentially with age. That's in essence what that means, in which we have an initial mortality level. What we have in NHANES, however, is we have individuals that start at a certain age. This is the baseline age, and each of them is going to observe for certain durations. In our case, we're going to be using the NHANES from the 1988 to 1994, and we have a follow-up up to 2015. So we have, for some individuals from 88 to 2015, we have over 17 or so years of exposure. So everyone will have a different exposure. So we could define the hazard of each individual at every age, which is now the age is the baseline age plus whatever time of observation they have been followed. It could be up to time maximum, or it could be less, depending on how much they were observed. And this equation could be written in this form, in which is now, instead of having the regular age of the individual, it has the initial age plus how much time they've been observed. This observation time could be either sensor time, it could be the age at death, or it could be whatever observation they were under during that period of time. If we assume there are no period of cohort effects in this particular case, then this equation could be split up into pieces. And here is the piece that comes, I think, interesting. One could estimate this model constraining these betas to be the same, so we can estimate only one beta. And what is interesting is under this approach, this parameter beta is measuring the acceleration of the mortality as time progresses. And it is an acceleration that is assessed over different time periods or cohorts. But again, we are under the scenario that there is no period of cohort effects, in which case this piece is the additional risk that is associated with the passage of age. In other words, once we put it in this form, this beta to indeed represent the acceleration from initial age to the follow-up age in the observation period, which basically represents the traditional Gompertz model. So the advantage of doing this approach is that it will allow us to model the follow-up time that we have in the NHANES. So this is the equation that we are going to be using, this form of the equation. This is a non-traditional form of the equation. For those who are familiar with fitting this type of models, whenever we use H on the left-hand side, we tend to use H as the time axis that one calls. But in this non-traditional form, we are using indeed the time that passages from initial observation until the end. So this is the equation that we're going to use to estimate this outcome dependence. So keep this form in mind. So now let me walk you through the steps that I had defined before, in which we have, in the first case, we have a model that only controls for H. So it looks a model like this. Now it becomes quite familiar to what I showed you before. This is a model that only adds H as a control in the hazard model. In the second model, we have a control that is the factor score that comes from the structural equation model. So every individual has a factor score. So we have the second equation. So what we say is, from this, now we're going to predict the hazard rate, meaning this equation in the log linear form becomes this one. And we're going to equate the left-hand side with the first equation, which is on the right-hand side. But instead of using CA, as we had originally, now we're going to become, this is going to become our estimate of biological age. So in other words, we are using two different slopes from the Gompertz model, one that only controls for age, one that in addition of age adds the factor score, and one can obtain that prediction for each individual in this form. Now, for each individual, this biological age would be different because each individual has her and his own factor score from the structural equation model. So one can follow almost the same approach, but instead of using mortality, as I said, we could be modeling any other type of disease or incidence of any other process that we might be interested in. And the idea will still hold. So those are the two flavors that we are going to produce. So to summarize, we're going to have then two different structural equation models. From each of them, we're going to have two flavors. Either is outcome free or is outcome dependent in both the linear and the nonlinear form. So that would leave us with four different estimates that one could estimate for biological age for each individual. So the data. So to show you how this proposed approach works, we're going to start with the NHANES from the 88-94. This is the National Health Interview Survey from the 80s. Is a representative sample of the US. We're going to look at people between the ages 30 to 75, and that leaves us with about over 9,100 people. Now, a quick note of why we decided to use this, and the reason is because one of the first papers that kind of spearheaded in some ways the use of the Clemara-Duval was a paper by Morgan Levine, in which she used this survey to show that the Clemara-Duval was very good at estimating mortality or estimating actually biological age and mortality biological age. And that was kind of the basis from which later on she developed the PhenoAge as supporting evidence that this is the survey that has been used to show that the Clemara-Duval is a really good method. So we went back to using the same survey and basically the same biomarkers that she used in that paper. So we have a way to compare. So here are the indicators that we're going to be using. 6 different systems. Metabolic function includes hemoglobin and total cholesterol, cardiac function, blood pressure, lung function, which is the forced expiratory volume, some kidney function, liver function, and immune and inflammation in the form of the C-reactive protein. So here are 9. If you count this one, there are 9 biomarkers in here that we'll be using to construct our equation. So the result that I'll show you, I'm going to group this into 4 sets of results. So you see what I'm going to be working you through. The first one is, once we construct this indicator, we want to see what happened with the slope and the intercept. As you might remember, that's part of the argument we're making, that we're sort of trying to make this more flexible without restricting the slope and intercept. So we want to show you those slopes. Second, once we produce a value of BA, then let's see how those values relate with sex, race, ethnicity, and education in NHANES, and again, compare this with what other methods would produce. And then I'm going to focus on the outcome dependent we could use that outcome dependent now that we are modeling Gompertz models as what we call the accelerated aging. And I'm going to show you what accelerated aging means in our context. And towards the end, I'm going to show you what would happen when one uses biological age to get an estimate on life expectancy. How would that have an impact on either longer or shorter life expectancy, depending on whether one is biologically older or biologically younger in terms of the value that comes up from our estimates. So let me walk you through one of the first things that we usually use in demographic, which is what we call the age patterns. So here is what I'll be showing you, a series of figures. On the left-hand side, we have the males, on the right-hand side, females. And I'm going to be overlaying in here the density that one produces from the different methods. Here are the different methods that I'm going to be showing you. What you are seeing now is the actual observed distribution of chronological age that comes from the NHANES. This is the observed values. If one uses the other methods, the black is what one would produce using Clemeret-Duval. This one in here, the pink, would be principal components, and this one is multiple regression, if I'm not mistaken. So one could immediately see that these two methods, either multiple regression or principal component, produce a univariate distribution that collapses individuals into kind of the center. And the Clemeret-Duval somewhat reproduces the underlying distribution of chronological age, which is in gray. Now let me show you what we produce with our estimators. Remember, there are 4 values: with the linear approach, outcome dependent or outcome free, and the nonlinear method, outcome dependent or outcome free. So here are the outcome dependent from the linear model. So 2 things that you can see is the outcome dependent is the dotted line, and the solid line is the outcome free. So you can see that the outcome free is a little bit higher than Clemeret-Duval, and the outcome dependent is underneath, but in both cases, we reproduce somewhat similar shape as the underlying age distribution. And in our case, when one uses the outcome dependent, we shift more values a little bit to the left, meaning we're making some people biologically younger, but on the other hand, we're making some older adults biologically older. And a little bit something similar happens with the females. If one uses now the nonlinear method, here are the green ones. Again, solid line is the outcome free, the dotted lines outcome dependent. So I think the main message from here is that regardless of which of these methods one uses, the ones that we propose, first we produce relatively reasonable values, which are, that's why I put the comparison in with the other methods. And in our case, either is linear or nonlinear, we produce values that are move a little bit to the left or a little bit more to the right, depending on the association with chronological age. So this is just to show you that the values that we produce are somewhat reasonable if one judges that by the distribution that we produce with the density. If one then compares what is also of interest, which is the association between chronological age and the predicted biological age. In this case, I'm showing you only 3 methods now: the Clemeret-Duval, multiple regression, principal components. And as one would expect, by design, Clemeret-Duval produces a model that goes through 0 with a slope of 1 in both cases, which is again by design. However, if one uses multiple regression principal components, one would see that none of those, neither the intercept nor the slope, are 0 or 1. So this is again by design of the method. It's already embedded in the way those values are constructed. If one then uses, for example, the linear outcome, the SEM linear approach that we produce, either the outcome free, this should have been the outcome dependent, I think. Probably, oh no, that's fine, because this is the outcome free, the linear flavor or the nonlinear flavor in the SEM. So one can see that in our case, the intercept in neither of the methods, models that we have in here, the intercept is not 0 and the slope is not 1. It is positive. What that means is as age, chronological age increases, biological age does increase, but it does not increase on a 1-to-1 basis, as the Clemeret-Duval would assume. In our case, if one uses the outcome-free estimate, that would suggest that when age increases by 1 unit, biological age increases by less, slightly slower increase in biological age relative to chronological age. If one then uses the outcome-dependent estimator, which is the one that is trained on mortality, it's quite interesting because now the slope is actually greater than 1. So what our estimate using the outcome-dependent would indicate is that actually biological age increases at a faster rate than chronological age. This is consistent with the idea of senescent mortality that we use in demography, and the left-hand side in the outcome-free that increases not on 1-to-1, but slightly less than 1, would be consistent with the idea of mortality selection. To the extent that is mortality selection, one would expect that this is not a 1-to-1, it's slightly less than 1. But if one assumes there is this senescence mortality that we sometimes use in demography, then one would expect this is increasing faster than 1. In either case, the important thing is that with the model that we're proposing, we could actually test those possibilities again, in contrast to this one, which by design, this is 0 and the slope is 1. Next set of results, if one links, now we're going to be looking at the difference between biological age and chronological age. Some of the methods have looked at the difference as an indicator of the biological aging. Positive values in this difference means the individual is biologically older. Negative values means the individual is biologically younger. So here are the associations that one would obtain if we use the predicted values from each of these different methods and runs a regression controlling for age, sex, race, ethnicity, education. So there are several interesting results in here. One, I'm going to be focusing again on the left-hand side and what we obtain with our outcome-dependent approach. If one uses Clemmer-Duval, one would obtain that age is not associated with this difference in biological age and chronological age, meaning an increase on age is not associated with the average, whether the individual is biologically older or biologically younger. And one would obtain that there are no sex differences in that value if one uses Clemmer-Duval. However, if one uses the outcome dependent, either the linear or nonlinear model, we indeed find that age is associated with that difference in biological age and chronological age. And we do indeed find sex differences in the direction that one would expect. On average, women tend to have a smaller difference on BA minus CA relative to what one would obtain among men. Another set of interesting results, if one looks at the plain fitting of the model, the data is much better fitted when one uses the outcome dependent than if one uses any of the other approaches. And in terms of the race ethnicity of education differentials, we obtain coefficients that are going in similar direction. However, these coefficients are much larger than when we obtain in both cases for race ethnicity of educational differences. And what we interpret this to represent is that these values tend to be noisier, and therefore the coefficients are much larger, and our method is tighter, produces more closer values, and the coefficients are not as big as one would obtain with the other methods. So this is, again, another example to show that if one is interested not only on estimating biological age, but also on associating biological age with other indicators, perhaps the outcome dependent seems to be better suited for those approaches. In terms of the aging that I was, Lauren, you have a question?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I just have a quick clarification question on the prior slide. We were just talking about this the other week. So with all of these methods, are you estimating the slopes separately for men and women? Like
Yes.
when you're doing the underlying Clemmer-Duval or the SEM modeling?
Yes, exactly. So this is the model in which biological age was estimated only with this value, with this method. And then we produce this set of estimates. And then I produce biological age with multiple regression and run these estimates and so on. These are independent models. Is that what your question is?
Well, my question was, so when you're inputting all those physiological measures, unless in the case of the Clemmer-Duval method, my understanding is that they're calculating the slopes differently for men and women when they're inputting all of those.
Oh, yes, exactly. I did exactly the same process for all of them. Yes, I did separate models for men and women. I'm just pulling the results in here when I run the regressions. Yes.
So then are the differences that we're seeing here between men and women reflecting differences in mortality? Because at this point you've already projected it onto mortality, or because it seems like we wouldn't expect to see differences between men and women if the parameters were already adjusted by sex in a way.
Well, I'm not sure about that, because what we are observing here is the difference how different biological age is relative to chronological age. So if one think of sex differences, particularly over age, remember the Clemera-Duval is not really trained on mortality. This one is trained on mortality.
So do you think that's why you're picking up sex differences there?
Yes, that's why I think, yes, I would assume that, yes. Again, this is, yeah, Jason?
I have a quick question too.
Oh, yeah, sure, go ahead.
My other quick question was like, because just looking at these distributions and seeing the coefficients on the, by race, it seems like your method does a better job of maybe dealing with these extreme outliers that might be like skewing these values, up in some of these other methods. Can you talk a little bit about these outliers and is that why you think you're seeing, better results that might make more sense by race in terms of the coefficients here? They're not like so.
I think it has to do with when I was showing here, well, actually you can see it in here, how when one, because what I'm really modeling in this slide, I'm modeling the difference between BA and CA. So it would be values that are above or below the diagonal, in essence. Anyone that is on the 45-degree line would be 0. Anyone above 45-degree line would be positive, or below the 45-degree line would be negative. So that's what I'm modeling in the last equation. So what you see in here is how much variability there is in the Clemera-Duval. If I were to take a 45-degree, which is in essence, this is a 45-degree line. This is a slope of 1 and pretty much goes to the slope, through the origin. There is much variability, which values, some of them are very large on the positive side, mostly. And when one looks at the outcome dependent, these are very tight values around it. So that's what I was describing before. Part of the larger coefficients in here, we think is associated with this underlying larger distribution that this method produces relative to one way of
this outlier thing where the other methods are producing more like kind of extreme outliers than your method.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Em.
I think this is, so I know a lot less about this than you and Alberto and Lauren. So I'm going to ask maybe more of a dumb question about when you plotted the chronological age distribution of the NHANES, and then you were showing what the different distributions of biological age, exactly this figure in front of us. Biological age being latent, we don't know what the truth is about the distribution, right? And so how do you think about evaluating like which of these are good versus bad? Is the logic that because you have a nationally representative sample that that the target is to in some way reproduce the chronological age distribution before, so not the ones that when you're not the outcome dependent ones, so that should be aligning, that's anchoring mortality as future mortality, right? But the other ones, I don't know what the distribution should look like. What's your thoughts on, is that a well-posed question? And if so, yes. What's your thoughts on it?
No, it is. And actually, Alberto and I kind of debated for a long time how meaningful this could actually be, exactly because we don't have sort of a benchmark. We don't know what the biological age is. The reason for showing you this is just to see that the values that we produce are somewhat comparable. That's why when I was presenting this, I referred to them as being somewhat reasonable, somewhat comparable. But I'm not saying our values are somewhat better than the others, because exactly I don't know which one is the correct underlying biological age distribution that one would observe. The point for us was to just get a sense, once we produce these values from this method, where do we stand? How far away we are from what other people have done? Are we somewhat reasonable? Are we just far out there, producing values that are very different? But yeah. Does that make sense?
Before Ava's question, just to finish that thought, I've got a stronger intuition maybe of when you anchor it to mortality and whether you move in one direction or the other, it's telling you something about your population with respect to mortality. But the one, like the outcome-free ones, I don't have any intuition of what those quote unquote should look like. Do you have any like additional comments on what to think about the outcome-free versions of your analysis?
I think that's a really good point, because
like what's the anchor in some sense? Like again, the mortality makes it clearer to me of what you're trying to target. But the outcome-free one, I think I've just lost the thread of what that's supposed to be doing.
The anchor in the outcome-free, the way we did it, the anchor is really the underlying age distribution. Because you remember what we are doing in the outcome-free. Let me go back very quickly. In the outcome-free, what we do is, once we produce these factor scores, we're going to use the age distribution to kind of anchor what the beginning would be and how fast those values will increase, from which we predict the value, and that is what we assume it is the biological age. So we use this as the anchor because this is in essence what some of the other methods have done in the past. Multiple regression in essence does something along these lines. Clemmerad-Duval behind the scenes is doing something like this. These are actually having some of the criticisms recently with some of the second generation methods that they called, in which they don't want to predict a biological age that is necessarily dependent on chronological age. So, but one could imagine doing that. I mean, I'm anchoring that. That's why we call these two methods and not the only methods, but there are many other possible methods, and there are many other ways in which one could anchor and produce a value. The final comment that I would make is the reasoning for us behind the scenes of trying to produce a value for biological age is just to have something meaningful, that we could somehow attach a value to it. This is biological age. However, the factor score already produces that ranking on the underlying physiological deterioration. So one might well use this indicator directly if one is interested in modeling many other processes, not necessarily attached to a biological age value. And if one looks at the health and retirement study, for example, they have some epic logs recently that they produce in which the value is not an age. It is just an indicator. This factor score indeed is producing that value.
That's helpful. In terms of Ava and Alberto, is your question, is your point on top at this point, or is it
just
separate?
yeah, it's a follow-up.
The
correct that. Oh, go ahead, Jason.
Just in ordering, Ava has a question too.
Okay, sorry.
Jason, the same question. I have questions along this line, and you kind of opened the line of questioning that I was going for, so that's why I chimed in now. I don't know if Hiram would prefer us to wait later for the discussion.
No.
But so yes, this is exactly what's been going through my mind is in terms of, we're essentially making up what we think biological age should be, because, well, what is the gold standard? And I mean, in one sense, anchoring it to mortality makes a lot of sense, because that's what we think about is like, when are you going to die because of some underlying process, right? And not die from a car accident, but die, of a natural progression. But I guess to add to this line of questioning, I want to ask, have you thought about what criteria or conditions would disqualify a biological age measure from being relevant? Like, is there so if you were to see a particular association or a particular pattern, is there one that you can say, hey, this is not what we would expect of biological age, therefore the assumptions or the factors that we included in this, there's something wrong about that? So I guess I was thinking about maybe this is not right, but some of these gender differences, although females and males could age differently, but have you thought about some criteria that would disqualify a measure, because that might actually help us narrow down to what we're thinking about in terms of a proper biological age? And this is obviously, maybe it's going to take a longer time to think about that, but if you have, please do share it.
This is, I'm not sure let's say how I could answer this, or the way I would think about it. I think the way I think about biological age is that this is not a unique biological age value, that one could just produce this biological age and say this is the age that is associated with pretty much any type of outcome. That's why I'm sort of more keen on the outcome dependent, because I at least know what I'm trying to predict and what the value would somewhat represent. Just to give a quick example, in terms of mortality, if I were to predict biological age, not using mortality, but using, say, disability, I would probably find on general women having an older biological age. And it is just because women tend to live longer and tend to develop more disabilities than men. But that biological age that I would obtain is again tailored on the particular outcome. So if I were to use it, I might look different than the one that I'm producing now on mortality. And if I were to look at biological age associated with cardiovascular events, again, that might look quite different than if I use a biological age predictor on metabolic diseases.
Right.
Right. So that's what I'm having a hard time thinking. There is a unique biological age that links to everything.
Sure. And maybe I'll just add this comment and I'll leave it so you can continue with your presentation. But I think what you just stated seems more of we're getting into the area of how do we predict a particular outcome and what are the different predictors of this outcome, rather than, I mean, it's a question of what is biological age and how do we think about it. But from what you described, that seems not, to me, that's less of what I think about as biological aging and more of we're looking at the risk factors or biomarkers associated with a particular condition. But anyway, I mean, this is an interesting discussion. What do we mean by biological age? And so that's a can of worms, and I realize that you have your presentation to continue with. So thank you.
Yeah, but going back to your point, this is why I define biological as this underlying biological and physiological deterioration as we age. One can think of biological and physiological deterioration in terms of higher risk of death, but one could think of this as higher risk of developing chronic disease. Or one could think of this biological and physiological deterioration in terms of developing a disability. That's why I think the outcome dependent is interesting, because this biological and physiological deterioration could be understood under different type of indicator. There is not a unique, I think, biological and physiological deterioration. It depends on what might think as a biological underlying physiological deterioration. In our case, we're looking at mortality, which is kind of the ultimate physiological deterioration, but there could be other ones. Alberto?
I just wanted to add a couple of things, a couple of thoughts. First, going back to Jason's original question, I think that the methods that have been devised so far are just tricks to convert indicators that have a particular scale into an indicator that is completely meaningful and to us, and it cannot be questioned. Okay, that's what they do. They relate chronological age to those indicators, and then they come up with a gimmick and some sort of tricks, principal component, whatever, including the outcome free, to convert those into chronological, a biological age, which is, so that's what it is. Now, what the meaning of biological age is certainly not something that is being translated by those methods, I think. I think of biological age as it was defined some time ago in Finch and Kirkwood and the people who work on senescence. And the impression that I always got from that literature is that there's no such a thing as a single biological age, because the physiological system ages at different speeds. So, I may be very old, quote unquote, metabolically, but not very old cardiovascularly. So if you think of your physiology as the joint product of several subsystems, one could, in theory, think that the physiological age should be attached to a physiological system, and that is the set of those that makes what we call biological age. Okay, now, if that's the case, you need outcome-dependent measures. And so, for example, in theory, I could think of, mortality is the final outcome, so it measures everything. And in that sense, anchoring in mortality is a little bit less exciting in terms of coming up with something interesting. But if, for example, suppose that I have biomarkers of metabolic function and I have biomarkers of renal function, just come up, then I could think of a structural equation model where I model those two things as latent factors with different indicators, and I have two biological age for two different systems. And the question is, can I use those to predict outcomes that interest me? Mortality would be one of them. But if you do it outcome dependent, it has more meaning than if you do it outcome free, which is one of our methods and all the others, where you just simply use a trick to convert some indicators that are in some scale into your more familiar one, chronological age. That's why the distributions, Jason, I think the distributions that Hiram sent, I think are what Hiram was saying. They're just ways of telling you, look, we don't want to get too far away from chronological age, because after all the outcome-free methods are trying to translate the biomarkers into a chronological age. I'm sorry, maybe I complicated this thing too much, but
That was great, Alberto. I think that's exactly kind of what that answers some of those questions. So thank you.
I don't think, though, they're all trying to convert something to a measure of chronological age, like the POAM and PACE measures that are looking at rate of change and aging. What do you think about those? And then I also like this idea of separating out systems of aging into different indicators. I think that is kind of where the literature is going. I know Morgan has a recent paper on that. So, but what do you think of your measure in comparison to the POAM and PACE measures?
Those are quite different, but they for instance,
they're obviously different, but
right.
In terms of this critique that these are all just anchoring everything to chronological age, and they're not capturing anything meaningful.
They are still anchoring some of those into chronological age, like the Duden, I don't know how they call them, the Valsky indicator more recently. The most recent version he produced, he now tries to get at producing one value biological age using epigenetic indicators at age 38 in his sample. And now he translated that idea into, for example, using the Helen Rickerman study, in which he is still producing a value for biological age that is an age. It is an age. It is not a score.
It's the rate of aging. It's not. It doesn't.
He calls it the pace of aging, because those values are based on a growth curve model that models people as they move through time, because he has a survey that he followed for 15 or so many years. So he's able to model each individual, how their different biological indicators move through age, because this is a longitudinal study. Then at age 38, he takes epigenetic indicators of those people, not before, only at age 38, at which point then he says, okay, now that I've captured this physiological change over time of these people, how can that be linked to epigenetic indicators at adulthood, from which then I can produce an age. That is the one that he's producing. So
right,
it is indeed an age.
It's when you look at the outcome, it's not in age units. It's the measure that it produces is not in age units. It's in rate of change. It's a rate. It's not a chronological age value or an age value, because he's projecting the rate of all these physiological systems over time onto the epigenetic markers, which unfortunately can only be measured at a point in time. So that's my understanding of that measure. But I guess I feel like those types of measures are trying to get more of what you're saying. They're trying to move away from this chronological age projection critique, which has been in the field. So I'm just curious what you think about those measures in comparison to this structural equation approach.
I think they're somewhat similar to fall, I would say, within the idea of what Alberto was describing, because you look of how those methods are computed, for example, this Belsky indicator, they just take a weighted average of those slopes that they get on the growth curve model, and they just add them up. And that's kind of the accumulated deterioration for those people. So again, going back to what Alberto was saying, they're just trying to somehow condense that information into something that perhaps is for them reasonable to do, and trying to get at these changes over time of these individuals. I think what we are doing, what makes this approach quite different from those other approaches, is this use of the structural equation model. When one uses this structural equation model, I think it lands itself quite nicely in the sense that we are modeling this variance covariance structure, which is exactly how one might think of the association across all these different systems that are being measured by different biomarkers, as opposed to just a regression that looks through the mean and tries to estimate an overall change. We are not trying to estimate an overall change. We're trying to estimate how much covariance and correlations exist among all these different biomarkers, and how one might produce an indicator that represents that covariation across all of them, not the average change. And that is the factor score that we produce.
Nice.
So
Okay.
that's why
Thank you. Yeah, that makes
so
sense.
that's why I think, again, is quite unique and more interesting in that regard, because that's exactly how one might think about these physiological systems that are correlated, that are covariant of one another, and they are aging at different rates of those different biological systems. So I think we're capturing more when one does this type of approach. For instance, with Alberto, we're extending, this is based on a cross-sectional data, what we have now, but we are extending this type of approach into more longitudinal data. One could easily extend this SEM model into longitudinal approaches, and it becomes sort of a structural equation model embedded in a multi-level model, which is in essence a growth curve model. The difference is we are not going to be looking only at the overall change that the traditional growth curve model will do, but also again at these covariance correlations over time.
I see. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good. Any other questions? Great. So the last couple of slides that I'll show you is how one might, as I was describing, how one might think about linking some of these estimates that we produce into what we called the aging process. So in demography, we traditionally use this slope that one obtains from the Gompertz as a way to look at what is called the mortality rate doubling time, which is very simply computed. Like in this case, one obtains the Gompertz slope that one gets only controlling for age. This is the exponential increase in mortality rates with age. And one asks how long will it take for, if mortality continues at this speed, how long will it take for this value to double? So it will take about 8 years when one computes the Gompertz slope only with age. Then we could ask, what if in this model we now add the factor score that comes from this structural equation model? One would obtain a different slope, which is this slope goes down, and it would be associated with a doubling time of about 11.3. In other words, if one would take into account the physiological deterioration, the mortality rate will not increase as fast as if one does not take that into account. And we take this difference to represent how much of the change in this mortality rate doubling time could be associated to this underlying physiological deterioration. This is a typical indicator, the doubling time, that is used a lot in population biology in particular. Some of the work that Alberto was describing, the Finch and Kirkwood and others use this mortality rate doubling time. And we could actually do something along those lines in the case of the NHANES. And what is interesting is that one can see some results that are somewhat reasonable, what one might expect to obtain along the lines of, if one looks, for instance, among Hispanic Blacks, a lot of the aging is coming from this underlying physiological deterioration. Similarly with Mexican Americans, but although it's high among Hispanic Blacks, it's not as high as what it would obtain one in these other minority groups. So this is another way in which we use this type of model to try to link with what we call this aging process, that one can look at this, do this type of exercises to see how much of the physiological deterioration might be accounting for the aging of those populations. And the final slope, I'm gonna very quickly go into this one, which is just how predictive our model is in terms of mortality. We use this predictions area under the curve that one gets from these proportional hazard models. And this is just to show you that in general, our outcome dependent is quite accurate to predict mortality, which in some ways is perhaps not surprising because we're trained to be predicting mortality. The final results that I'll show you is this exercise that we did with Alberto, in which what we said was, let's look at what the impact on life expectancy might be associated with this underlying biological aging. And here is a figure that I'll show you. On the x-axis, we have the difference between biological age and chronological age. So positive values means there is an older biological age. Negative values means there is a younger biological age. Here are females and here are males. And then what we did is, let's compute the life expectancy for each of these scenarios, when one is 1 year older, 2 years older, and so on and so forth, or 1 year younger, 2 years younger, and so on. Compute life expectancy at 65, and then we're going to compare that with somebody who has not have an excess of biological age. And that is somebody who has exactly the same biological age as his or her chronological age. So that is, individuals who have exactly the same age, biological age, chronological age would be at the origin. And then when we compare those life expectancies, we take the ratios. So what we would expect to observe is, if there is older biological age, there would be perhaps a shorter life expectancy. If there is a younger biological age, it would be higher life expectancy. How short or how large the life expectancy would be is given by these percentages. So the values that I'll be showing you here are for all the different methods, Clemara-Duval, multiple regression, principal component, and so on and so forth. So here are the values that one obtains. The first thing that you notice are these circle red and green. These are the ones that come from the outcome-dependent models that we produce. Here's the Clemara-Duval, which is the black one is kind of behind this green stars. And here are the red stars that come from the outcome-free, and here are the multiple regression non-principal components here. So the main take-out message from here is that when one estimates the impact of life expectancy by being biologically older or biologically younger, if one uses the outcome-dependent, we would produce a much faster or shorter declines life expectancy if that is biologically older, but a much larger gains in life expectancy if the individual is biologically younger. The other methods will produce values that are more conservative, much shallower declines or more smaller increase in life expectancy if one uses those other methods to estimate the impact on life expectancy. So going back to the discussion that we were having, because we think this is a perhaps more meaningful indicator, the outcome dependent, is perhaps picking up more the impact of being biologically older or biologically younger, how that would have an impact on their remaining life expectancy. And that's why we see these larger, much faster declines or much faster increases, depending on biologically younger or biologically older individual might be. So those are the results that I wanted to show you of what are the implications in some ways that one could get from estimating this type of biological age in the way we've been proposing. What we have is that the general conclusions in here that we think the nonlinear function form perhaps is more suitable to estimating these values for biological age. We might not need to impose these parameter constraints in the methods, as some of other methods, particularly Clemara-Duval does. They imposed these constraints, so we don't think might actually be needed. And the values that we produce with the structural equation approach is somewhat comparable to these other ones. So it goes back to Jason's point. I'm not saying one is better than the other. All I'm saying is we're not just way out there with our values, are somewhat comparable. And these methods, in particular, the outcome dependent, seem to be much better at fitting the data, and in particular mortality, because we are sort of trained to be good at mortality. But also, this outcome dependent would allow us to look at different dimensions of aging. In our case, we train it to be responsive in some ways to mortality, but as I said, we could make this model outcome dependent on many other different types of outcomes. We think it's a fairly flexible and general approach of producing biological age. It allows us to have a lot of interpretations for the latent deterioration process and the accelerated aging. In this case, I showed you two examples through the mortality rate doubling time and through the impact on life expectancy. And we think by using this type of outcome-dependent approach, it might open the possibility of testing for many other biological agents in different physiological systems, as we were describing, which we could then tie to particular outcomes of interest. So in the interest of time, I might stop there, but just very quickly, I couldn't help but show you this additional result that we did with Alberto, in which one might think how sensitive, is our estimate to the biomarkers that one uses. Like in our case, I showed you biomarkers 9. So actually, we did an exercise with NHANES 99-2000 with a 2015 mortality follow-up, and we did two types of methods. What if we have all these 9 indicators that are shown with the solid lines? And what if we only use the 4 indicators that are in here highlighted? And if we use the 4 highlighted indicators, we get the dotted lines. So the bottom line is, if one uses, whether it uses the full set of indicators or a subset of the indicators, and one focuses on the outcome dependent, which has the ODs, we produce a much better values. In other words, outcome dependent is less sensitive to having fewer biomarkers. So here is the case for males, which is perhaps more clear. Here, these two are outcome free and with smaller set of biomarkers, and the outcome dependent are very close to the ones that have the full set of biomarkers. Now, very quickly, you might wonder why I use these biomarkers and these NHANES, because it turns out that the health and retirement study has these 4 biomarkers available beginning in 2006, 8, 10, 12, 14, and 16. These are the only 4 biomarkers that are available in HRS, and the HRS use the NHANES 1999-2000 to adjust their values. So when one uses HRS and produces prevalence values using that survey, we get some very reasonable values compared to the NHANES 99. So the bottom line is, if one uses HRS with the limited set of biomarkers that they have, which are these 4 in HRS, and uses the outcome dependent, chances are we might be able to produce a better biological age with our method than if one uses the outcome free, which is likely to produce kind of distorted values. We have done already that, and it actually works. So here is data from HRS from 2006, 2008, and 2010. Here are females and here are males. Here are the values that HRS has that are comparable over time, like hemoglobin, HDL cholesterol, total cholesterol, CRP, and cystatin C. And here are the values that we produce using our outcome-dependent estimator. So, and we are continuing with this line of work, and we feel it is quite promising, I think. So I'll leave it at that. Any questions?
Thank you, Hiram. So if you'll raise your hand, we'll queue things up, and we'll start with Ava.
I think Alberto was first. He beat me to the punch. Oh, you lowered your hand. Anyway, great. Thank you so much. This has been very informative. I'm thinking about some of the next steps and the discussion that we had earlier. When we think about all that could potentially go into biological age and these individual outcome dependent measures, how are you thinking about narrowing those down to the ones that will be the most informative? So you can think about, you're not going to necessarily have, a model that includes biological age or a predictive model for every single disease or condition out there, but you're going to think about some maybe bigger systems like inflammation, immunity, and so forth. So what are your thoughts on narrowing it down to the most informative ones? And what are your next steps?
Right. There are several steps. But one of them is along the lines of what Alberto already indicated, having different latent constructs. In this case, I only had one latent construct associated with biomarkers. We are building another model in which, on top of these biomarkers, we have a separate latent construct associated with epigenetics. And then we could further start looking at biomarkers that are associated with particular physiological systems. And then when one trains that factor score that comes from that model will look at outcomes associated with that system. For instance, I could have a biological age associated with the metabolic diseases, perhaps a biological age associated with cardiovascular outcomes, or as I was saying, disability. One is interested in older adults. So I think that it opens precisely the possibility of having biological ages tailored, you will, to particular outcomes of interest. And you could be using the availability of biomarkers or data that is in the particular survey. Right now, I think as a demographers, we are somewhat limited in the number of biomarkers that are available to use in that type of surveys, like this example with the health and retirement study, which is the largest aging study in the world, basically. And it only has 5 biomarkers, just to give you an example. So there are not the biomarkers that you will find in an NHANES that has hundreds of biomarkers. So we're going to be, I guess, somewhat restricted, but also by the type of information one has to go forward with this type of indicators.
Yes. So I have 2 or 3 questions. The first one is a pretty general one. It's related to what Jason talked about earlier, which is how you generally evaluate the performance of the metric produced in this type of work. So, for example, you showed a bunch of scatter plots to show that the biological age inferred from your approach can be correlated with the chronological age. But would you agree that the most boring result you could possibly see is to see a perfect correlation? So in that case, my intuition is that maybe what you actually want to see is sort of the outliers, right? You want your metric to be able to identify interesting outliers with a very big deviation from biological age and your chronological age, and then try to say something about those outliers. So in a way, it's almost like you want to see this messy scatter plot so that you can actually have more outliers than other approach. Would that be a fair comment? I wonder what kind of metric people use to kind of evaluate that. So that's the first question. The second question is more just about the outcome dependent metric. I wonder if you can explain a little bit more about how this would differ from training a model to directly predict the outcome. Because sort of the approach you're talking about is still based on biological age. I got lost in some of the details, but it's almost like when you have a metric that is predictive of biological age, then you fine tune it to make it outcome dependent. But what if you just directly train, say, epigenetic clock for mortality, and if you get something like that, how would that differ from the outcome dependent version of your metric? That would be my question.
Yeah, thank you. So let me start perhaps with the last one. The advantage of using this approach that we propose in terms of the outcome dependent is precisely because we're trying to understand and connect. In our case, we say with the aging process, that's where we tailor it to mortality. You are correct. We don't have to use the approach that we use. In fact, if you look into the literature in big data, there are actually now methods that use machine learning approaches to predict biological age. The problem is you don't know what's going behind the scenes, and you don't know how to connect that with any physiological system, with any underlying biological processes. So the advantage, again, of doing it through this way is it would allow us to more precisely try to identify what biological processes might be linked to the biological age that one is computing. For example, in the most recent paper, I think that Lauren was referring to by Levine, who has been doing a lot of work on these epigenetic clocks. What she does is just steps back and says, here are a bunch of epigenetic clocks that people have computed. They use all different sorts of CPG regions. Let me see if I get all those CPG regions into different blocks and get a better sense of this block is associated with more particular metabolic indicators, with more recovering of all different biological meanings of those blocks, and then how much of each epigenetic clock is being composed of these different modules. Because if I do that, then I get a better sense of what is it that epigenetic clock is picking up, what biological process I'm understanding by using the CP clock as opposed to this other. So actually the process is in the reverse to what you might suggest. The process is not, let's just throw them into a machine learning approach to see if they are better at predicting the outcome. The process is actually the opposite. Let's get a better understanding what is it that this clock is capturing and what is telling me about the underlying biological process. So our approach of, in this particular case, tailoring to mortality through this hazard model allows to get a better sense of what is it that we're picking up with this outcome dependent. In terms of the performance, I don't think there is, at least I have not seen people using any type of measure to say this is the performance of the model, this is doing well or not. In fact, if you look at the early papers, even the most recent ones, I don't think people actually use these age pattern figures that I showed you. They don't tend to look at how the values they produce are behaving. How do they just look at the underlying age distribution? It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but you know how comparable they are to that. So I don't think people tend to look at that. And in terms of picking up outliers, we do produce a little bit of outliers depending on the method, in particular the nonlinear method, as you can imagine, because it is a nonlinear that in our case is an exponential association. Some individuals who tend to have really large values on some of the biomarkers end up having biological ages of over 130 or so years. So we do have a few of those individuals, which, as you indicated, is picking up some of the underlying biological markers that these individuals already have. How one would look at the performance. In our case, for instance, I didn't go into the details, but when we compute the outcome dependent, using this hazard model, we indicate that if one produces exactly the same underlying age distribution, perhaps the value that we produce from the factor score is not picking up any of the underlying biological processes, because otherwise you won't be able to differentiate using the biological indicator or not using it, because you'll be producing exactly the same values. So what we want is some value from the factor score that is discriminating across individuals and therefore is producing some biological age.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe just a very quick follow-up. So let's say we have an interesting outcome of interest, but it's measured in a different cohort. Is there any way to produce outcome-dependent biological age using what you can train from your data, but potentially a set of different outcomes measured in a different data set?
That's a good point. I'm not sure. Probably, but I would, like in our case, what we are using in the outcome dependent is this factor score that by design is unitless, and that's why we're trying to assign a unit to it by using this outcome dependent. So yeah, I'm not sure what you have in mind of using.
It's really just a random thought, because you listed a number of biomarkers, and for example, in Wisconsin, we have a Alzheimer's cohort with very good amyloid measurements, but I don't think they have epigenetic marks. But they have genetics. So if there is a way to, for example, leverage unique cohorts like this with very interesting biomarkers to generate potentially more meaningful biological age, I think that will be advancing the field, right? But really, for me, it's a random thought. But, yeah.
I see your point. Yes, we started with this national level survey, but yeah, part of the idea with Alberto is to move, for instance, the Framingham that has a very long follow-up and that has several biomarkers, to start looking into extending this approach into using more biomarkers. As I indicated at the beginning, ideally would want to include biomarkers from several systems, not only the physiological indicators that I included, but also these neurodegenerative markers of epigenetics or any other types of markers, which most of the times are available only in this type of epidemiologic studies, not usually national level studies. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Alberto, did you want to also raise a comment or question?
I'm sorry. I just wanted to go back to a point that Eva raised by asking, how do you disqualify any of these estimators? And Hiram, can you show the slide where you have the tables with the slopes? What happens with the slopes among women? Yeah, no, I think is the.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I thought it was the table. This one.
I think that's the one. No. Where you show the reduction in the Gompertz slope. that takes place once you, this one. So I think Eva's point is well taken, because one of the things that I was thinking is that in order to disqualify any of these things, you have to have a strong theory to do it. And for example, in this case, what you see is females have faster aging than males. That's the first thing that you would say, well, I would, if I believe in the weathering hypotheses, for example, among African Americans, then I would expect that to be the case, and you see it. And also you would see the reductions when you introduce biomarkers to be, I would expect them to be of a certain type if I believe in the weathering hypothesis. What I'm trying to say is that in order to answer your question, is there any way to disqualify any of this thing, you have to have a very strong theory about what is it producing acceleration of aging in the particular physiological system that you're studying. And I was thinking that in this case, for example, if the biomarkers that we have in the outcome dependent are in fact getting at the weathering, you would expect the reduction to be larger among females, say African-American females, than among the rest of the population or something like that. Does that make sense? I'm just trying to respond to your initial question.
No, it makes sense. And I think, I mean, obviously you guys have thought more about this. I don't even work with biological aging. I was just trying to think about what are, related to Jason's question. And the one that was in my mind was, we can do a lot of different things, but what are we actually aiming to do with biological age? And what should we be doing? What's its ultimate purpose? How will we be using it? And therefore, thinking about what you just brought up is the theory behind it. Should we, what kind of a theory should we have behind it? And what should it be correlated with, and what should it not be correlated with? And kind of what patterns should we expect it to follow? Basically, how do we define biological age? And that's a, you can have more than one answer to that, depending on your research. So.
Yeah. And then there's the other thing of the finding, for example, that I think it was Eileen Crimmins, and correct me if I'm wrong, Levine, who made the statement that in the US, although the US was aging, the biological age was moving less rapidly. And that it's something that probably is a result of the fact that some of the biomarkers that we have respond to treatment or to changes of behavior. And so you could use those features to judge whether your marker of biological age is actually doing what it's supposed to be doing. I know it's a vague answer.
Yeah, no. I actually, well, just to keep going off of that, from what you've said, kind of the way that I view the way you guys view, I mean, you tell me if this is the way you view it, the philosophy around biological age is that ultimately we're interested in knowing from birth to death, having some sort of measure that will tell you that eventually. And that's your biological age. And that biological age is comprised of different components and whether, your risk of different diseases. And you are trying to identify these components that and combine them to predict ultimately mortality. And not only, not include every single one under the sun, because honestly, that's not going to be practical. I mean, even with Alzheimer's disease, we're trying to figure out what causes Alzheimer's disease and which biomarkers are related to Alzheimer's disease. What's more practical is to think about bigger systems and what actually tracks with mortality. Can we predict when a person will pass away? Based on these measures from the time that they're born. Like, are they 70% of the way there, 80%, and so forth? So that's kind of how I viewed what you presented, is that we have all these individual prediction models that go into what we think about as biological age.
One other thing, so two things. The first one's a small point here. That I thought it was very persuasive when you were showing that figure that we were looking at a couple times, where you showed that the regression and the PCA just seemed to be terrible, right? That's how I interpreted the when you overlaid all the results based on chronological age. It's not this one; it's the one that we went back to before, where you had way too many 50-year-olds essentially in the biological age. Is that how so when you did your distribution? Did you read this differently? Like when I see that, I thought you were going to say, the yellow line, less extent the pink line, but the yellow line in particular is terrible, right? That method, we'd have to believe something really strange about this population to think that the yellow method is giving us anything sensible. Is that overstating what we should think about when we see this?
No, I think you're correct. And this going back to what Alberto said, these are just ways to trying to condense information, but by the method itself is just like in the case of I think this is multiple regression, pulls everything through the mean with a very univariate distribution.
Right. I mean, it seems like a terrible way of doing it. I wonder if there's any reason, like if someone using PCA or multiple regression looked at this, if they would ever have any defense. Just a little bit, just like a minor point of whether maybe this graph puts to rest some of the, like those two methods for this type of work. My question is a little bit bigger picture. Is it right to say that this type of analysis doesn't put differential weight on whether my biological age is moving me to ages that are like really terrible compared to ages that are not so terrible? Like what I'm envisioning is that age is like okay, and then it just drops off. Essentially, like in your system, like in the actual biological systems, there's a lot of stasis and kind of like things are going okay, and then at quite a bit older ages, 70s or 80s, things just drop off a cliff. If that's true, which you can just say it's not true. If that's true, does this method allow that kind of distinguishing? Like you'd much rather be, tagged as a 60-year-old than an 80 because of that cliff that I'm describing. So that's a two-part, like, is there an actual cliff? Have I just got that wrong? And if there is, should the biological age really allow differential like weights essentially on how bad it is to be tagged later than earlier? So again, let me know if the questions are not
no, these are very interesting. This is actually a pretty good point, Jason. That's a really good question, and this is cross-sectional data, so I wouldn't be able to pick up on those changes precisely that you're thinking changes over age.
But in your model of like latent biological age, is the model in your head that there is like a collapse of systems that's really nonlinear? I guess that's my question, is about nonlinearity in this, and whether there's like a major backbone assumption of linearity instead in chronological age, just being like you get one every year, so it's just linear, but the biological age underneath it is like quite nonlinear at the tail, I guess, is my question.
And you're right, and that's why I think part of the idea of what we propose with a nonlinear approach, we started with a relatively simple nonlinear model, but precisely you can think of other types of models, even not necessarily continuous functions, but perhaps it's a step of functions. The association between chronological and biological age, in which to a certain age, you would expect perhaps a linear increase, perhaps later an exponential, and even, after 65, 70, a certain age, based on the evidence that we might have of how the physiological systems might be working, you can have even a faster increase. Yep, I think that could be built into the model. Exactly. Yep, I would agree with that. And even the most recent data, like the method that Lauren was referring to from New Zealand, the pace of change, they have a very small, younger sample. So they won't be able to yet pick up on these changes that occur at older ages. because they only have one cohort that was born in 1974, if I'm not mistaken, or 1975. That's the only cohort they study. So those people are in the early mid 40s, so they haven't gotten yet to the 60s, 70s, or even 80s.
This has just been a fabulous talk, Hiram, and thank you for sticking around later for the individual meeting.
Sure.
So I know
Yeah, sure.
everyone will thank you in their muted scenarios, but thanks again for this,
No,
and we'll
pleasure.
look forward to those individual talks. Thanks everyone for coming, and we'll do
Thank
some
you, everyone,
announcements
for
for
coming.
next week too.